Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Unlock Show. I'm your host, Tracy Wilson, and it is fantastic to be here with you guys today. And I say that because I am very, very excited about this particular episode because the person I have got for you today speaks my language. He speaks all things podcasts, and you know me. I've been doing this show for I don't know how long now, but I absolutely love it. So anytime I get to speak to somebody else who loves podcasting and live shows and thought leadership and brand awareness as much as I do, it really does light me up. So I hope you guys are, really into or sitting on the edge of your seat, waiting to hear what Graham Brown, my special guest, has to say today. Let me tell you a little bit about him, because once you hear the people that he has worked with, if you're not already sitting on the edge of your seat, you're going to be. So he's a published author on the subject of the digital transformation of communication. We're going to be talking a lot about that. And his work has actually been featured in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and he has helped really shape the communication strategies of some of the world's leading organizations. And these organizations are, big organizations such as AirAsia, Xero, Vodafone, Nokia, Disney, MTV, Monster Drinks, and those are just to name a few. The list goes on and on and on. So he's a passionate storyteller, and he's leveraging his 20 years of experience through corporate planning, etc., to be able to help other people just like you and I and corporate organizations find their voice with podcasts. So without further ado, I want to say a huge welcome to Graham all the way from Singapore this morning. And we did a little bit of a geography lesson just before we jumped on, and I had to figure out where he was originally from. So we'll see if any of you guys can recognize the accent, and maybe you can type into the chat and let us know where you think Graham is originally from. Welcome to the show, Graham. Great to have you here.
Tracy, it's wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm not from
most...
Wales or Northern Ireland, or wherever it was you guessed I was.
Well, I had a bit of a go.
Close.
I mean, you only said it was like a couple of words, right? And trying to kind of grab that. I was in the right vicinity. So anyway, he's given you guys a bit of a clue. Not from Wales and not from Ireland, but in that kind of vicinity. So let's kick this off with, you've traveled the world a fair bit, and that sort of has brought you to landing in Singapore and sort of, putting down some roots in Singapore and starting your own agency. But tell me a little bit about how that came to be, and, why are you these days so passionate about helping people find their voice and share their skills, information, experience through the power of podcasting?
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah, I'm here in Singapore. I came here 4 years ago to set up a podcast business, which, if you think about in 2018, in the world, podcasting wasn't really a thing like it is now. And especially, if you're on the east side of the world, it's even less so. So when I came here in 2018, people were like, why do you want to set up a podcast business? Why don't you get on YouTube? And it was pretty difficult getting people to understand what podcasting was about in 2018. Obviously, the pandemic has helped a lot. A bit of backstory to that. I've been in communications all my life. I was in a telecoms business in the early 2000s, built that business, sold that business. And in 2012, was faced with the decision, like most entrepreneurs, like, do you start another business? What do you do? So myself, my wife, and my son, who was 6 at the time, we decided that we would go travel for a bit. And we bought a one-way ticket. We flew to New Zealand, your old stomping ground. We flew to New Zealand, one-way ticket, and then traveled the world for just under 6 years. Well, 4 years mainly traveling. And then we settled down a bit, living out of suitcases. The reason why that's relevant to podcast is we were living on an island just off Africa. There's a group of islands they're part of Spain politically, the Canary Islands. They're like little volcanic islands, but geographically they're part of Africa. We were living out there, and beautiful lifestyle, very Spanish, mañana, drinking coffee in the sun. But as an entrepreneur myself, I really enjoy that kind of I enjoy this conversation. I enjoy that kind of camaraderie you get with other creators and change makers. And I didn't have that on an island. It's all beaches and palm trees, which looks great. But if you're an entrepreneur, you really want that. So I started a podcast. This was in 2014, just to reach out to people. And, because I was lonely, I wanted to connect with entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
And I started that podcast. Like some years later, people got interested in podcast. I was moved from that place out to Okinawa in Asia, and people started asking me, how do I do this? And that was the beginning of the podcasting as a business. People were saying, how do I do this? How do I, I've got something to share. I want to talk to people. I want to connect with people. This was 2017. So that was the beginning when I thought, actually, do I want to live on this tropical island for the rest of my life, or do I actually want to create something? And it was that sort of sticking in me, that creating part wouldn't let me go. So that's what became the podcast agency.
I mean, and how awesome is that this kind of forum for communication allows us to have the best of both worlds, right? Because, I mean, you could be sat on an island with not very many people around, but still connecting with people. And that's the beauty of this. What's quite interesting, I suppose, is, if we dial back to 2018 when, we're talking pre-pandemic, we're talking podcasting was out there, but not in the way that it's in now. And I know you talk a lot about sort of this digital transformation and what's happened over the last little while. Do you want to just give us a bit more of an insight into that? Like, what have you seen has happened in this kind of digital communication space over the last, 2018, what are we talking, 4 years? But a lot's happened in that time, right? So I want to give everybody a little bit of an insight into that.
Yeah, if you look at the data today, there's 5 million podcasts and about 50 million episodes out on the major platforms, Apple and Spotify. So that's just really exploded. And everybody says, oh, but everybody has a podcast now. But when you look at it, 5 million, is that actually everybody? Because if you go all the way back, let's go back to the late 90s and where we were with the internet. So in the late 90s, let's say it's 98. So 98, this is, I don't know if you remember, Tracy, this was the world of Netscape Navigator and all that, very, very old school internet. Internet Explorer is probably the most popular browser back then. That world, very early stages, we hadn't really seen Amazon blow up. We hadn't really seen Google pick up. Take us back to that time. Think about how early the internet was then. There were 5 million websites in the world. And today there are like 2 billion. Now, if you think about it, when you ask me about, that world of communication, what is changing? Well, I think people are realizing, companies, individuals like ourselves are realizing that podcasts are a much better way of connecting than what was there before. If you are a brand, or you're a large corporate, or even a startup, what were your options before? You wrote white papers, you sent out press releases, you got a booth at a trade show, and all of that comes with, firstly, it's very inefficient, and secondly, all the time invested in doing that, and thirdly, is it really effective now that people aren't traveling? So podcasts are a great way to connect with people, both personally and in business. And if you think about that, then you look at the numbers, 5 million. Well, the reality is that if you look at corporates, and that's my space in podcasts, what they're doing is that now, if you went back 4 years and compared them, they're very different. 4 years ago, one brand, one podcast. Today, one brand, 10 podcasts, 20 podcasts. So you have management consultancies that have, maybe 10 podcasts, and each one is a different practice, a different vertical sector. One might be insurance, one might be operations, one might be, they have their teams on these different podcasts. So now you look at 5 million and think, actually, that's not a lot, because the future is happening now. And that future is one company, many podcasts. You could have inside a company 100, maybe 1,000 podcasts. Every team, every leader, every project has its own podcast. And it takes us all the way back to 1998, which is that people are realizing this is a much more effective way of connecting between, it could be, back in 98, a retail store and customers, getting the opening hours or getting the directions. But that's all happening now. So, we could have hundreds of millions of podcasts, and it's happening that people are realizing this isn't about creating content, this is about connection.
And I think that is such a valid thing, to talk about, because, often if we look back in the past, those big businesses were able to kind of spend the money. They had the big budgets to be able to reach the audiences, where nowadays, with the power of podcasting, a one-man band, somebody with very little budget, can now start to compete in the same realm as a really big business that's got, loads of money. So, I mean, I think that's extremely exciting. The other part that, you're talking about here is that ability to be able to communicate, but realizing that you don't want to necessarily communicate to be all things to everybody. And I think this is what you're seeing when you're working. And we're seeing this with large corporate companies that are going, actually, that department can talk about that particular subject matter. This department can talk about that subject matter, et cetera, et cetera. And so that gives them the ability to be able to have multiple podcasts from the same business, but speaking about a slightly different topic that reaches a very specific audience. And I think that's quite important. And we'll get to that, because I think that's a really important piece for us to understand when we're starting out in creating our podcast and making sure that we are speaking to a very specific audience and not to everyone, speaking to someone rather than everyone. And I think that's a really important factor. The other thing that is quite interesting when we talk about these sort of the statistics and the data is, 5 million podcasts. But then when we break it down and, people are creating their podcasts on, daily, or, people are jumping into the podcasting space regularly. However, I don't know if you've got any statistics or numbers that you can share with us here, but, how many of them actually stick at it? Because I think one of the things you talk about with your agency, right, is this concept of growing a lime tree. It takes time. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, and that it's not a strategy for almost a one series type scenario. You want to stick at this over time.
Yeah. Well, take your podcast, for example, Tracy, that you've published well over 150 episodes now. I'm just having a look.
I don't know. Yeah, something like that.
I'm looking at Apple, 155 today, so it'll be different when this goes out. But that's all about consistency, and it's all about putting in workflows. It's all about making sure that you publish regularly. The cadence publishing. You seem to be publishing once a week. Very consistently. That's really important, because podcasting is a marathon, not a sprint. It's all about long-term building your message, building your audience, one listener at a time. Now you've got to go into it that long-term attitude, and that's what pays off. People get selfish. People get maybe short-term focus when it comes to podcasting, and they think, I'm just going to create this thing, it's going to blow up, I'm going to get lots of visitors. That's exactly like the attitude people had when the internet offered this sort of fire hose of visitors and traffic to your website. It doesn't happen. You don't build a website and suddenly you get lots of visitors. You've got to then graft. You don't write a book and then suddenly get lots of sales. You've got to go and graft. It's the same with a podcast. You've got to create the podcast and graft. You've got to publish it week in, week out. And back to the data, I don't have the data to hand, but anecdotally, there has been research published on this. Something like 60% of podcasts on iTunes or Apple Podcasts now have not made it beyond 6 episodes. That's the pod phase. That's the valley of death, right? So many of them. And the reason is firstly, the podcast owner doesn't have an idea of why they're doing it. Secondly, they don't have workflows in place. Thirdly, they often don't have a team of people around them, because what happens is you can do a podcast when you're motivated. But if you look at great content creators or great storytellers, it's not about motivation. A really good example of this is Stephen King, the best-selling writer of all time, nonfiction writer. I know maybe J.K. Rowling's past him now. But Stephen King, he said that every morning he woke up and he got on his old typewriter, in the old days, his typewriter, and he bashed out 2,000 words in the morning, whether he felt the love for it or not. He did the 2,000 words, he typed them out, and 95% of the time, he took that paper and he scrunched it up and threw it in the basket, right? And got rid of it. But that discipline of just doing it every single day is what made him a best-selling author. It wasn't, oh, today I'm going to write an amazing novel. I'm going to write, one of his blockbusters. It doesn't happen like that. It's that discipline of showing up and doing the work. As they say, motivation is for amateurs. And it's the same with podcasting. It's the consistency that creates quality and the gains over time. And that is what wins in the world of podcasting, is having those workflows to push out 150 plus episodes. And then people say, oh, Tracy. No, which Tracy? Oh, Tracy, she does Unlocked. Oh, yeah, I see that. It keeps coming up on my feed. Keeps coming through, and I see her doing this live show, and it's like, bang, you're now the X guy in their attention. And that's a really valuable piece of real estate. And that's the game you've got to play. Long-term, consistent, patient, but that pays off.
Absolutely. And it pays off big time over, with that level of consistency and just doing it over and over and being dedicated. And I think the other thing that, often we miss in this, because we think about when we're starting out, hey, okay, well, I'm going to create a podcast and it's going to bring me sales. And there's a big part of this that I think we underestimate is the amount of personal growth you actually get through showing up, speaking, and doing it, like you say, on the grind, week in, week out. It just prepares, and I just had this conversation with someone else around, strengthening our grit muscle to enable us to just keep going. So I think it is, by far one of the best things. Hence the reason I'm a big advocate for, for finding your voice in podcasting, because it really does help you in so many other areas of your life, not just in, hey, I'm going to get a few sales from going to get a number of sales for my business. So in terms of like starting out, let's say we're talking to people who are thinking about, I've got something I want to share, like those guys that was said to you, hey, Graham, how did you do that? I've got some stuff I want to share and I want to be able to do a podcast. What are some things that people should start thinking about right at the outset before they even push the, go live button?
Who is the listener? That's probably the number one area most overlooked by podcasters. And to see that, go to the world of radio. Now, the interesting thing about radio is that, radio is 100 years old as an industry, and they've always said it was going away. It was always a sunset industry, but it's always hung on. It's always defied all the analysts and the critics. Radio is still going. And the reason why radio is still going, despite all the competition for ad dollars, is that what radio is really good at is what podcasters don't do. And that is that radio speaks to you. And I knew an old radio hand, an old host, a sort of a grizzled radio DJ who had people contact him and write to him, like community would reach out to him in the old days, the mailbag and stuff like that. When I worked in student radio, and he would take a photo. He had this photo stuck on his microphone, and it with the on-air mic. And I asked him, like, what was that? I thought it was his wife or something. And he said, no, it's a listener. And he gave her a name, like Julie or something. And he said, like, Julie sent me this photo of her. And so I stuck it on my microphone. And every time I go live on there, I talk to Julie, like as if I'm talking just one-on-one to her. And that really made me think, because he doesn't do the show and say, you guys, like YouTube style. He doesn't say listeners. He talks to you. So you out there, he knows very well who you are. He knows your name, really importantly, because that's, if you look at the world of advertising, they have these concepts called pen profiles, which is where they define the person they're trying to talk to. They give them a name. These are not just users or visitors. And then they say, the important part here is once you define the you that you're talking to, what is her or his pain points? What are the frustrations that they feel? What are the things that keep them up at night? What are the big changes in their industry that are really bothering them right now? Because once you speak to their pain, once you lean into that pain, then you have a reason why you're doing the podcast. Because you are there to speak to that pain and say to that person, I'm not an expert. I'm no expert in this matter, but I understand your pain. And that's expert mode off, empathy mode on. I get it. I've been there. I understand what you're feeling. You're a small business owner and you're struggling to, get leads for your business. I understand you because I've been there. I was a small business owner. I was hustling, trying to do everything, nothing coming in. I get it. I've been there. And let me tell you what I think the solution is. And that's where you have permission now to share content on the podcast. So number one, Tracy, and a lot of people, I've done hundreds, maybe thousands of podcast episodes, and I've gone into podcasts and, I just want to do this thing, right? And I enjoy it, but I don't think about who the listener is. And then, many, many episodes in, I'm wondering why my audience isn't growing. And the reason my audience isn't growing is because I'm not building a community like a radio show. I'm not generating that commitment that people feel that Graham is talking to me. Therefore, I'm going to show up for the next one, or I'm going to go back and listen to all the old ones. So start with you. Start with the audience avatar and define them, name them. What's their job roles? What's their age? What's their name? What's their pain points? What are the big changes? And why are you the person to solve their problem? Why do they trust you? And once you get that, and once you put that front and center, like, you put that photo of Julie on your microphone, now you can speak to that person. And that just gets everything focused, because exactly as you said earlier, Tracy, it's got to be something to somebody, not everything to everybody. And that person's listening, you're listening, and you're thinking, are they speaking to me? Or is this for me? If it's not 100% on target, well, 5 million podcasts, we've got a lot of choice out there. And that is quite overlooked as a starting point in the world of podcasting, because it's very much build it and they will come attitude towards it. But you can hit a huge uplift. If you get that right, you'll grow your business organically.
And that's that whole concept of show them that you actually know them. Like, they're listening to you. She knows me. She gets me. She understands. And I think this medium that we have now with podcasting is we've got to remember that people are choosing to dial in and put us very intimately into their ears. And usually when they're doing other things, it's usually as they might be running, they might be looking after their kids at home. I've had a woman tell me, I put you up on my phone as I'm doing the dishes, and I'm, trying to get the house in some sort of order at 10 a.m. in the morning. They're listening. And so knowing and understanding that our family, our community of listeners are actually, doing and going about their everyday life and trying to achieve whatever it is that your podcast, says it's going to help them to achieve. They're trying to absorb all of that at that time. So I think it's important too, like as you're saying, really understand who they are, what they're about, what do they value, what do they even care or give a crap about, what are they doing in these moments, and that helps us to really formulate that real. And even for the podcaster, that intimate understanding of who we're trying to communicate with makes a really big difference. I know the next part of that, which we've kind of talked about, is what do they want? So let's kind of go down that path. So we've established, like, who are they? What are their pain points? How do we know what they actually want from the information that they're trying to get from you?
Yeah, you've mentioned a few of the keywords here, Tracy. Community is a big part of it. That not only is that what they want, but it's also a great way of finding out what they want. That if you go back to the radio analogy, if you've ever listened to local radio, there's a great example of a content medium where people are really struggling to find content. They're digging around to find content. They don't have the resources as well. So they will talk a lot to the community. and they'll get the community to contribute as well. I mean, if you sit in a taxi anywhere in the world, I mean, I went to Barcelona not so recently, and you sit in the back of the taxi, and the taxi driver at night has got the local radio on, and he's listening to people phone in and talk about Barcelona Football Club, talk about what the manager's doing, the latest game. There's no actual game coverage on the radio. It's just people talking about the game. And that's what people want. They want that community. People want that connection, that shared experience around what you're talking about. And you're planting a flag for people, and people are rallying around. That's what you're giving them. You're giving them that tribe. You mentioned family. There are strong emotional connections here. That's how you find out, because, insights are a function of the trust that people have in you, right? So if people trust you, they'll tell you. Like you say, if somebody, a lady messaged you and said that she was doing the dishes at 10, and she was listening to you, and so she shared a moment with you, right? And that's important, because actually now probably the content is less important than the context of how you are connected and what it's about. And I think people focus too much on the content side of things, which is, this isn't about content, this is about connection, this is about community. The total addressable market for loneliness is 7 billion people in the world, right?
Yeah.
So if you can create something that connects people, and why did podcasting explode during the pandemic? It wasn't
for that very reason, right?
Exactly. Yeah. People were reaching out. Why did I? We start podcasts. We want to connect. What a great way of doing it. That's what you want to give them.
What's really interesting, Graham, I was actually talking to somebody, had him on my show a few weeks ago, and he was talking about the study that he had done, and it was around what do people value. And so he got these really deep insights into what humans actually value, and that belonging was number one. So the sense of belonging, and like you've just mentioned, through the pandemic, I mean, podcasts they soared because people were looking for a way to be able to no longer feel isolated, lonely. You'd created, not that it was a beach, but you'd created that kind of isolation in our own homes, and we're wanting to feel connected to people. And the beauty of podcasting allows us to do that, and in a way that I think you can't do that sort of thing through print media. You just can't have that same level of connectedness. I know you talk about, authentic communication, and I want to explore that a little bit more, because, typically I know you work with a lot of large corporates. And so how do you get a large corporate organization to take their very, professional, imagery and information and levels of communication, and get that down to a point where it's really intimate and really authentic? And why is that so important?
Baby steps. The answer here. So let's look at what authenticity is, and maybe we can understand it in the context of how corporations communicate. Now, this is very easy. You and I, Tracy, speaking like this, because we're just being ourselves, and we don't have handlers. We don't have a list of questions we can and can't discuss within reason. That's pretty much, we're in control of our own messaging. But when you start taking that into the world of brand and corporate, it changes. You've got brand managers, comms heads, you've got marcoms. So their role is obviously to protect the brand, and understandably, they are concerned about somebody going onto a podcast and sharing hashtag whatever, and that blowing up, because that does happen. And we've seen that on social media platforms. That's the general level of lack of confidence in the platform, because it hasn't been around long enough as a communication tool for companies. And it was the same with the internet. People were a little bit afraid in the early days of, if I do this, what's going to happen? If we share content. But that changes, and generationally, those attitudes change as well. So younger people obviously come into the workplace, and then they change this idea. If you look at how companies treat social media now, it's very different to what it was 20 years ago, where it's very much about control. It was about listening. Everybody was keen on listening, watching out for people complaining about your airline, for example, on social media, and then getting on it straight away. That's all changed now. People still do that, but the zeitgeist of using these channels is connecting with people as opposed to policing people. I think it's the same with communication as well, is that the attitudes will change. You've got to give them what we call the guardrails and green lights, which are basically the safe space that a corporate leader can play in, and knowing that they're not going to say anything wrong on a podcast. Now, the key here is if you rock up to a podcast and you're very corporate, and people do this, is that they, first of all, everything's scripted. And, these are the only questions I'm going to answer. And this is how I'm going to answer it. And I want to edit everything afterwards. What you're doing is just effectively giving people a press release. So why bother? Why do it in the first place? You're giving nothing that I can't read on your website. So why are you wasting everybody's time? And that's the key, because that's how corporations have communicated for 100 years. It's all been about efficiency, because the least efficient part in that whole communications game is the human being, right? In the whole factory model, machines are very efficient, but humans are the ones that screw it up, right? But you need the humans to do it. It's the same with communication. That's why we have corporate comms and PR, because it's all about efficiency. It's all about polishing. It's all about making sure it's perfect. But human beings aren't that. Human beings are vulnerable. Human beings make mistakes. Human beings are authentic. So when a corporate leader goes on a podcast and say, yeah, okay, we didn't get that right, or we could do that better, or this is what I think, or this is off script, people say, oh, actually, this guy's a human being, and I am going to forgive him, or he banks my goodwill for anything that they do in the future. And that takes bravery. It takes somebody to stand up and say, I'm going to communicate this. And you see brands do this all the time. Years before podcasting, I saw Howard Schultz from Starbucks, the CEO. He stood up and said, let's talk about race. This was in, 2004, 2005. And he got absolutely pilloried in social media and the press. Like, oh, why are Starbucks the ones who talk about race? But look at it now. Everybody wants to know what that company's opinion is on Black Lives Matters or diversity or inclusion or DEI or whatever it is. So that's the point. It takes somebody brave to stand up and do this. And, podcasting is a great way of doing that, because you mentioned the personal development side. You can stand up and get it right. You can go on stage, because every single one of these podcasts is a stage. You can go on stage before an audience, practice your content, your storytelling, and get the feedback. Okay, the way I talked about, our corporate take on that didn't work as well as I wanted to, but I'm going to go on stage next week and do it all over again and improve on it. So I think it is baby steps. It's doing it within a safe space, but ultimately at the end of the day, it takes a leader to stand up and say, I want to do this, and be brave, put their head, and face rejection, put their head above the parapet and face rejection. Not everybody wants to do that in the world of corporate, especially if you've been successful. If you've got 25 years of experience in corporates, it's going to be hard. But this is what people want now. Audiences want, they want their leaders to come on these kind of podcasts, like Unlocked, and be themselves. That's what we want now, because people follow people, not brands, right?
Absolutely. I've got a number of other questions, and I do want to go down these couple of paths. But, in terms of it's much easier for, like you mentioned, you and I to just get up here and just talk about our stuff. And, it takes this concept of thought leadership. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, and how one creates themselves as their own personal brand, and also elevates their level of thought leadership. So I know that there'll be people that are out there that are crapping themselves, like, oh my God, I want to do it. Like internally, I know I've got something good to say. I know I've got some, things that can help other people. You come from that place. But something inside of you is like, I'm scared to do that. I'm frightened that I'm going to say the wrong thing. I don't know if I'm ready to be chopped down. Like all of those things that you've spoken about. And what I can say after doing this for nearly 200, nearly 150 odd, nearly 200 episodes, is that you do grow that muscle, right? That resilience muscle, and be okay with it. But what can people do to help build their thought leadership?
Yeah, that's such a great question. There's two parts to that, really. There's firstly, like, what is thought leadership? And then secondly, what can you do? Because you have to know what thought leadership is before you can do it. And thought leadership really is not about title. It's not about having a qualification anymore. I mean, these all count, but they don't count like they used to. It's not about writing a book. The days that you could write a book and become a thought leader are gone. Everybody writes books now. That look at Amazon, the number of books on it, and people can't give them away for free, right? That's the reality. So the landscape in thought leadership have shifted fundamentally in 20 years. So we need to think about what thought leadership is before we start doing it. And really, thought leadership is, are you that X guy? What is that X in people's minds? And probably the biggest way of quantifying thought leadership is Google search. So if I go onto Google search and I type in data science, or I type in machine learning, whatever it may be, where do you come up on the results? That's what defines thought leadership. It's quantified. You can't game that. You can't hire a PR agency and get yourself up those rankings. It's all about putting in the work. Now, that's what thought leadership is. It's not about a position that you hold, which would have been the case. Oh, you're the CEO of this big company. A good example of that is as we've seen recently, Donald Trump, ex-president of the US, was in a Twitter battle with Greta Thunberg, the climate activist, 19-year-old Swedish lady. And in that Twitter battle, quite clearly, Greta Thunberg was winning. So you had a teenager taking on the president of the United States and winning the battle for hearts and minds about climate change. That's thought leadership. It's not about, the traditional authority. It's about the attention that you have. So if you have attention, you are a leader. And think about that. Attention is the new currency of leadership. So if you have it, you are a leader. You either use it or lose it. So if you have somebody's attention, like if people are coming to you on your podcast and they're saying, oh, you do this for me, or that episode, it really hit me here. You have their attention. Attention is extremely valuable. It's the most important commodity in business today. The average person unlocks their phone 110 times a day. That's the world that we live in, right? So if you can have somebody's attention whilst they're doing the dishes, that's really valuable. And that's what thought leadership is. It's not defined by your position. Now, to the second point, Tracy, you asked about how do we do it? Well, it really is about facing rejection. And this is the hard part. There's no easy wins here. I think about building thought leadership like stand-up comedy. Now, I'm always in awe of those stand-up comics, when they go on stage in front of the mic and it's just them. They don't have a guitar to play, and they don't have any kind of like PowerPoint presentations. It's just, they don't have any sort of props. They just go on there and they stand in front of like sometimes 10 people, drunk, or people heckling, and then they tell jokes. And I see these guys and I think, wow, it's like, I'm really in awe of what they do, because they put themselves on stage completely vulnerable. Like people shout at them and, it's just them. They can't hide behind, they don't have like a pseudonym. It's just them. So that really is how you do it. In that you look at, for example, stand-up comics, how they get really good. And the key here, Tracy, and you talked about, touched on the imposter syndrome for a lot of people. We all have it. Is that no comedian was born funny. Every single comedian that you see on stage, whether, you go back to the classics like Jerry Seinfeld, or the model one, the more modern ones like, Kevin Hart, for example, on stage, that is the result of thousands of hours that you haven't seen of rejection. They get on stage, they commit their content to the audience, and then they get feedback. That's what I call agile storytelling, which is like storytelling in a very agile way. It's like commit, get feedback, improve. It doesn't come day one. You get on stage, and I talk about the 80-20 rule in podcasting, which is basically every podcast, 80% of the material is what you've practiced and refined. You've got your sort of your content. Comedians always sort of do it in sort of jokes and sketches, right? So you've got all that content there, and 20% is like, okay, maybe I'll tell that story a little bit differently this time. Punchline's different, or delivery on the language or the tone, whatever. And that didn't work. It bombed. You got went straight over their head, reaction. And then you take that and you think, actually, how can I do that better? That's how you get really, really good at thought leadership, is get on stage. The great thing is you can get on stage in your pajamas, right? On a podcast. Get on stage, face an audience. You talk about the personal development. That is what it's about. It's about getting better as a storyteller, because storytelling affects everything. It affects everything from, all the sales you're getting now is the result of the stories you've been telling 2 or 3 months ago. It's the upstream that affects the downstream results of your business. So that's how you create thought leadership. Get on stage, practice, face rejection, get good, get comfortable at being uncomfortable, improve. And what you see now, every single thought leader out there, you may think, oh, they're really confident. They're natural. They're not. That's just practice. That is how you do it.
Absolutely. And I would say, if you're worried about that, go back and have a look at, early days of people podcasting. Listen to, say, their first episode, and then listen to them now. And that'll give you a real contrast, and you'll see it's a journey. It really is. And again, this concept that you're talking about of like storytelling. And I think that's it's quite interesting, right? Is that I think podcasting has really taken off because people are, and it's like reality TV. People are so interested. They want to know the real side of what's actually going on. What is this person really about? What do they do in their day? What failures have they had? And it's so that we can feel a sense of normality. I'm normal. I do those things too. It gives you that connection. But you talk about storytelling in this kind of world of communication. How important is that? And how does somebody sharpen their sword when it comes to knowing what stories to tell? And then you talked about like using some stories, then getting that feedback, being agile, getting the feedback and go, the way that I told that story didn't quite hit the mark. I need to kind of twist this, pivot it a little bit, and maybe I'll retell it. And how do you know what stories to tell? How do you then gather that feedback to know that I need to make an adjustment to that story?
Wow. Your questions are really spot on today, Tracy. What stories to tell? I don't think you'll ever know that off the bat. It will, there's a lot of cultural narrative now. And again, narrative is a story. There's a lot of cultural narrative now about find your why. And a lot of people say, oh, you've got to find your why. And if you look at it, it says you've got to have this big overarching story about what difference you're making in the world. And if you're not doing that, then, you're not really going to do anything important. And I think about that and think that's probably the most disempowering narrative out there that people have sort of absorbed without questioning it. Because if you look at thought leaders and storytellers and, anybody who gets on stage as a public speaker or, the iconic business leaders like the Steve Jobses and so on, they never had a why starting out. They never knew what their stories would be. They just knew that they wanted to do this. They got on stage effectively, whether that was stages, literal stages or in front of investors or in front of their first employees or in front of clients or on the media. Every stage is an opportunity to practice. They got on stage and they thought, well, let me just start with this bit of content. I'm going to tell you the story about, how I graduated in 1995 and, whatever the story is. And then they get feedback and, okay, well, maybe that's not a story. That's not a joke. That's not yet, refined enough, not funny enough, that in the sort of stand-up comic world. Nobody has those stories. It's just practice, practice, practice. And I bet you this. And, you, the listener, me, Tracy, if you looked at your journey, and you mentioned the word, and I love that word, journey. If you look at your journey in life, I can guarantee two things about it. Firstly, it's a mess. That the most interesting journeys are always like a mess. They're never a straight line. You weren't the guy that, graduated with an aeronautics degree and then went and worked for Boeing and then designed planes all his life because he loved, as a kid, little model planes. Nobody was like that. That's like that's 1% of 1%. The people who kind of all the stars are aligned day one. Nobody. Most of us sort of like, oh, well, I leave university and I'm not sure what I want to do. I'm going to travel a bit and then, explore, and then, things happen. And what happens is like 20 or 30 years later, when you look back on it and you think, actually, lots and lots of different things going on in my life. For me, graduated with a degree in AI, went and worked in Japan, communications, telecoms, podcasting, traveled the world. Doesn't make sense. But the more you get out on stage and start committing that content to the world, the more the world will tell you, actually, those are the dots that you can join here. And you look at it and think, actually, this does make sense. I never had a why for this, but 20 years on, I can look back on it and it makes like this cohesive narrative that I've always struggled with. For me, it's, for example, that my story is I'm a storyteller. That's how I help brands. And that's where I started, always telling stories, always on a journey, always exploring and helping other people tell stories, whether it was with mobile phones or with podcasts. So I think the key here is that nobody has a story out of the gate, and don't let that stop you. Don't let it disempower you, because I feel people think they've got to have a finished book to have a story worth telling. But actually the best story is a work in progress, because, you can gather your merry band of adventurers with you on that journey and go off on that rocky road, the path to adventure together, and they feel they're part of it. So and the second thing, just very lastly, regarding that is, I bet in your story, my story, your story, Tracy, you, the listener, is that in your story, there was a scene in your life which is found in every single movie, every single book, and it's called the departure scene. And that is a pivotal point in your journey where you left. Now, leaving can be anything. You can leave a bank to go and join a startup. You can leave a country. You can move somewhere new. Whatever it is, you've left something in your journey, and that has defined you. Because if you tell me the departure scene in your life, like for me, I graduated with a degree in AI and then went and taught English in Japan, right? It didn't make sense, but it was my departure scene, or one of my departure scenes, right? And through that, you understand, where did that person come from? What's important to them, and what did they leave behind? And we get a really good sense of who you are and what you've sacrificed as well. And I bet you, the listener, has that departure scene in their life, in your life, right? Therefore, if you've done that, that alone is inspiration for somebody who needs to hear it. There's somebody thinking, oh, I'm staring out the window in my office in the bank, thinking about some exciting fintech company I can work for. But you've done that. So tell me your story. And therefore, you have a story worth telling, because you have an audience of one who needs to hear it. You can change that person and give them a pathway in moving forward. And if you look at every single movie, it's there. Those departure scenes, every single movie has one. The hero leaves the comfortable world, like Lord of the Rings, because I know you're Kiwi. Like they leave Hobbiton, the comfort of the Shire, crosses the river. So there's often in a departure scene, there's a physical boundary they cross. They the hobbits, they cross the river on the ferry, and they get to the other side, and they leave comfort behind. And they know once they're across the river, they're committed. That band of adventurers have to go on that journey together, because now it's like, who are we going to meet on this road? What kind of perils? What kind of guides? What kind of mentors are going to show up? That's the journey that they take. But that scene defines the whole narrative. So when somebody asks you, what do you do? No, don't tell them what's on your business card. Take them on a journey. And great way of finding your first story is to tell them what happened when you left. And I guarantee you're going to get one or two responses. One is like, okay, that guy is not interested in what I've got to talk about. Or they're going to go, wow, tell me more. And then you know, like to your point, Tracy, earlier about speak only to those people where you mean something. That's the person you want to speak to, not the other one. You're wasting your time with them.
Because they go, wow, I want to do that too. That's me. They see themselves in your, the story that you've painted or the picture you've painted in their mind. They can actually transport themselves into that story. And they go, now, and as you say, you're talking about, you're taking them on the journey in the moment, not at the end of the story when it's all finished, wrapped up with a pretty little bow. You're actually allowing them to be part of the journey with you. And a lot of people will say, hey, I want to get on that bus with you. I want to go where you're going. I want to do what you're doing. How do I do that? And that's the beauty of this, right? Is us being able to do exactly that for people. And I love the fact that you're talking about, because I think one of the big mistakes that we often make is that, and I know I've made this in the past too, is like how-to type of content, and we're teaching people, teach, how to, and we need to balance that with, like you're talking about, like weaving in stories that have a level of inspiration to them, that actually connect deeply with the audience because you know and understand them. And there may be a component of, and this is how you do it, to the actual story and the framework of the of the podcast or the episode that you're doing, which I think is really important. And it's often something that I think podcasters tend to get, or communicators tend to get wrong, because we want to go down the path of teach, tell, when in fact we need to be able to bring people in on the journey and allow them to be part of that, to have a more experiential learning experience with you.
Yeah, you mentioned the key word there, Tracy, teach. Like, go back to your school. I'm thinking of my school now, school days. They're many years ago. But I think, you, the listener as well, like, think of those. I bet there's one teacher in your mind that you could probably name them right now. I'm thinking of Mr. Davies, and he was my sort of a maths stroke physics teacher, did everything. And what a boring subject that was. But he made it so interesting, because I even remember, I can picture it now, like being in the maths room and like all the kids, and it was a boys' school, all the boys there, just kind of like leaning in, and he was kind of standing on the table, and he was, I think at the time, trying to explain the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection, like reflecting light. And it was kind of like, almost like, trying to hang off the light in the ceiling. But it was like, I remember that now, 40 years on? That's the craziness. I think how memorable that was, and how you talk about how experiential that was. He didn't do the how-to. That was the sort of the last 10%. He told the stories of ancient Greeks and, those kind of crazy inventors. And we were just like, oh, well, I've got double physics now. I'm looking forward to that, because it's going to be stories. And that's what I'm going to remember. And you think about it, we always remember the stories. And that is why, as parents, or, in school with kids, we tell them stories. That's how people learn. If you want to tell your kids, if you want to impress upon children the importance of hard work and saving, if you look around successful people, inside every successful person, they've worked hard, they've sacrificed, the short term for the long term, and they've saved, whether that is investing in themselves, like learning, or saved money, and they weren't spendthrift. And those are successful people. You can't cheat that, the fundamental physics of success, right? So how do we teach that to kids? Do we sit them down and do the how-to, or do we tell them the story of the three little pigs? Because I bet you every single kid in the world, in different cultures, there's versions of that story, Three Little Pigs. And what does that teach them? A 5-minute story has taught billions, literally billions of people, the importance of sacrifice and of hard work and building. Those pigs that built the house out of stone, the ones that are still with us, the ones that wanted to play, they got gobbled up by the wolf, right, kids? And still today, 50 years on, 40 years on, it's here. We remember all of that. So think about that. Story is how we convey meaning and action to people. And once you've got people in on the story, then they're motivated to learn. Oh, maybe I need to think about investment, or maybe I need to sort of start reading some books, or maybe I need to do my homework. that's when people think about, oh, what how-tos do I need to do that, right? But until you have them
Mm.
at that level of story, there's no motivation to do it. So I think we underestimate just the extent to which almost everything in culture is learned through story, and almost all influence comes from story. We think it's once upon a time, but yeah, maybe with 5-year-olds. But once you start doing it with 25 and 35-year-olds, it's still once upon a time, but in a different format, like this, for example.
Absolutely. It's the bridge that connects the now to the future. And and when we're able to do that and they see, oh, that's where I want to go, we created something aspirational. You've then created the desire to want to know how to do that and how to get there. I mean, this is we could talk for hours and hours on this stuff, I know, Graham, because it's such interesting stuff, right? I mean, and yes, we've been talking about podcasting and the power of, and there's so many other things that we could go down the path of in terms of, numbers and data and whys and how fors and all of that sort of stuff. But I think the keys out of today is that I believe everybody has something to share. And when you share it, you can impact, if it's just one person, you're saying if you impact one person at a time, how powerful your voice, your message, your leadership can be in changing the world for better. We have that power at our fingertips to be able to do this. And your organization, your company, and I'll allow you, to talk a little bit about that, based out of Singapore, really does help corporate organizations kind of become real, provide that opportunity for them to be able to communicate very intimately with an audience that provides more, opportunity for them to become real, become part of the hearts and minds of their audience, but also obviously grow their business, which is what they all ultimately want to do. So I want to tell everybody a little bit about where, if they're interested, where they can find more about you, your agency that helps people put podcasts together. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and maybe where we can find you?
Yeah, well, I feel like you did a better job of it. So in terms of the description of what we do, yeah, I mean, if you want to find out about storytelling, podcasting, I would go to my personal website, which is grahamdbrown.com, grahamdbrown.com. Find out about the podcast services that I help both corporates with, but also individuals. So I help individuals get onto podcasts. So, some people love podcasts. A lot of people love podcasts, but they don't have the time to start one or the resources. So we help them speak on podcasts, which get you on stage, get you out there, practice your story. So that's one thing that I do. And also, if you're interested generally in storytelling, I mean, as you and I, Tracy, have talked on for nearly an hour, it's like you can go really deep into this world. I think people love stories, and people want to know the techniques and the designs and the frameworks to become a better storyteller, because there is a science to it as well. So I share that as well on the website. So that's me, grahamdbrown.com.
Well, there you go, guys. So I've popped that at the bottom of the screen. It's running over the screen right now. We'll also put it into the show notes, grahamdbrown.com. You can head over there and you can get more amazing stuff from Graham. I think you guys, I certainly have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Like I said right at the beginning, I knew I would, because he'll be speaking my language. He's doing my thing. So I really enjoy that. And I really do believe that, podcasting, live shows, showing up authentically is absolutely the way to go to build your thought leadership and to create, more opportunities for your businesses. And it's going to be around for a very, very long time. I cannot see this going away anytime soon. So that being said, Graham, I want to thank you very, very much for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I actually hope that you'll come back again and we can continue this conversation further and talk about more podcasting fun stuff. And, and for everybody else, you guys know that we go live on the Unlock Show Wednesdays and Fridays, 10 a.m. are our days that we go live. I have amazing guests on the show, and I want to make sure that you guys get the opportunity to really connect with them and, do my best to try and pull out as much information, useful information from each and every guest, so that you, the listener, can go away and actually implement these things into your business, your family, or your life. So until we meet again, which will be next Wednesday, go and live your life unlocked, because there is just no other way. And I'm going to see you guys again sometime real soon. Bye for now.